The day my son went to our pastor to ask how much money I had, I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee and reading through 20 pages of bank statements. And I already knew, even without proof, that I was about to have to do the most painful thing I had ever done in my 63 years on this earth. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Helen Mae Washington. I taught 3rd grade for 35 years at Cascade Elementary School in Atlanta, Georgia. I raised 2 children, buried a husband, and paid off a house just under 3,000 square feet in Buckhead with my own hands and his. I am not a woman who panics. I am not a woman who falls apart. I am a woman who watches. And I had been watching for a very long time. The first thing you need to understand about me is where I came from. I was born in Macon, Georgia, the 3rd daughter of Lillian and Earl Johnson. My mother did hair out of our kitchen on Hazel Street every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. My father was a tailor. Between the 2 of them, they kept 5 children fed, clothed, and in school shoes that fit. We were not poor, not in spirit, but money was always counted carefully in our house. Every dollar had a name before it was spent. That is the first thing my parents gave me the understanding that a dollar is not just a dollar. It is a decision. I earned a full academic scholarship to Spelman College in 1979. I was the first in my family to attend a 4-year university. My mother pressed my best dress the night before I left and told me, "Helen Mae, what you build with your own mind and your own hands, nobody can ever take that from you." I have thought about those words more times than I can count. I graduated in 1983 with a degree in elementary education and started teaching 3rd grade the following fall. I loved those children with everything I had, 700 of them over 35 years. I learned their handwriting, their habits, the way their voices changed when they were nervous, the particular silence of a child who was hiding something. Teaching 3rd grade does not just teach you about children. It teaches you about human nature, about who people are before the world has fully told them who to be. I met Robert Washington in the spring of 1984 at a potluck dinner at Greater Salem Baptist Church. He was tall, quiet, and slow to smile, but when he did smile, his whole face changed like a light coming on in a room. He was a civil engineer with the Georgia Department of Transportation. He built bridges for a living. I always thought that was fitting. We were married on June 8, 1985, in a small ceremony at Greater Salem. 47 people attended. My mother cried through the entire service. Robert's mother did too. From the very beginning, Robert and I operated by the same set of principles. We never said them out loud, we didn't need to. We simply lived by them. We never bought anything on credit that we could not pay off in full by the end of the month. We saved at least 20% of every paycheck, even in the lean years, even when the children were small and the grocery bill seemed impossible. We believed in real estate and land, and something you could stand on and point to and say, "This is ours." And we never, not once in 40 years of marriage, talked about our finances with anyone outside our household. Not at church, not at family gatherings, not with neighbors. What we had was ours, and ours meant the 2 of us. In 1998, we purchased our home on Waverly Lane in Buckhead, 4 bedrooms, a screened back porch, and a backyard where I immediately planted azaleas along the side fence, because I had always wanted them. The following spring, Robert added the largest one himself, a Formosa variety against the back fence where the old oak tree grew. The price was $187,000. Several of our neighbors on that street, all of them white, seemed genuinely surprised that we were the ones moving in. Robert noticed. He said nothing. He carried our boxes inside with a straight back and a quiet dignity that I have never forgotten. We paid that house off completely in 2018. The day we made the final payment, Robert came home with a bottle of sparkling cider we didn't drink and 2 crystal glasses, and we stood at the kitchen window looking out at the azaleas, and he said, "May, nobody can ever put us out." We also purchased a rental property in Decatur in 2005, a 4-unit building on Glenwood Avenue. We used the rental income to pay for Darnell's tuition at Georgia Tech and Tanya's undergraduate degree at Clark Atlanta University. After the children finished school, the income became what Robert called our slow river, steady, reliable, always flowing. By the time Robert passed, our combined assets looked like this. The Buckhead house, approximately $620,000 in current market value, fully owned and debt-free. The Decatur rental property, approximately $340,000. An investment portfolio that Robert had built carefully over 30 years, approximately $280,000. Retirement accounts, approximately $195,000. Total just over $1.4 million. I tell you these numbers because they matter to what comes next. They are what this story is about, not just the money itself, but what the money represented. 40 years of discipline. 40 years of sacrifice. 40 years of two people who started with nothing and chose every single day to build something that would outlast them. Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March of 2019. He was gone by November. The last weeks were very hard. He slept most of the time. He couldn't eat. He lost 30 pounds in 2 months. But there was one evening, a Tuesday in late October, when the light in the bedroom was going golden and the azaleas in the back garden had long since faded for the fall, when he took my hand and spoke clearly. "May," he said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to hear it." I told him I was listening. "Be careful with Darnell." He stopped like the words cost him something. "I don't want to say this. He's my son and I love him. But something changed in that boy when he married Brianna. I've watched it for 2 years now, and I can't unknow what I've seen. You promise me you'll watch too." I promised him. I held his hand until he fell asleep. Those were the last real words Robert Washington ever said to me that mattered, and I carried them with me quietly for the next 4 years. I want to be honest with you about Darnell, because this story does not work if you see him as a villain from the beginning. He was not. He was my son, and for the first 33 years of his life, he was someone I was profoundly proud of. He was the child who stayed after school to help his teachers clean the classroom. He mowed the lawn without being asked. He read every book on Robert's shelf, engineering manuals, biographies, history, because he was simply hungry to understand how things worked. He graduated from Georgia Tech in 2008 with a degree in electrical engineering and walked into a job at Atlanta Energy Solutions at $95,000 a year. He called me the night he got the offer, and he cried not from shock, but from gratitude. "I just want to make you and Dad proud, Mom," he said. He did. For a long time, he really did. On Sundays, Darnell came home for dinner. He sat at the table across from Robert and talked about work, about the city, about whatever book he was reading. He helped his father fix the fence in the back garden one autumn weekend, the two of them working side by side for an entire Saturday without needing to fill the silence. That was one of the last really good days Robert had before he got sick. Darnell before 2017 was a man I would have trusted with my life. Brianna Caldwell entered our world in 2015. She was 31 when she met Darnell at a real estate networking event in Midtown. She was striking high cheekbones, a sharp smile, the kind of confident bearing that fills a room. She was a licensed real estate agent working for one of the larger brokerages in Atlanta, and she talked about money with a fluency and an ease that I recognized immediately. I did not dislike Brianna. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing I could point to in those early months, no specific thing she said or did that I could call wrong. But there was something, a quality I noticed the very first Sunday she came to dinner, that put me on alert. Brianna did not look at people when she spoke to them. Not really. Her eyes moved. They scanned. When she talked to you, her gaze drifted over your shoulder, as if she were perpetually taking inventory of whatever room she was standing in. It was subtle. Most people would never notice. But 35 years in a classroom teaches you to read eyes. And Brianna Caldwell's eyes were always working. They were married in September 2017. After the wedding, things shifted slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Darnell stopped coming home for Sunday dinner as regularly. When he did come, the conversations were different. He began asking questions he had never asked before. How was my retirement account looking? Had Robert and I ever set up a living trust? What were my plans for the Decatur property? Had I thought about updating my will? I answered his questions. I was careful not to give specifics. And I noticed that Brianna always seemed to redirect the conversation when it drifted away from finances. One Sunday afternoon in the fall of 2020, Brianna sat across from me at this very kitchen table and said in a very casual voice, "This house must be worth so much more than what you paid for it, Helen. Buckhead prices have gone crazy. I'd estimate you're sitting on close to $600,000 here, maybe more." She said it the way you might comment on the weather. Then she poured herself more iced tea and started talking about something else entirely. I smiled and said I wouldn't know about that. And I opened the small blue notebook I kept in the drawer beneath the kitchen table, and later that evening I wrote down the date, the exact words, and a single question in red pen. Why does she need to know? My daughter Tanya was 34 years old at the start of this story, and she was in almost every way the opposite of her brother. Where Darnell was strategic, Tanya was direct. Where Darnell learned to conceal, Tanya wore everything on her face. She was a high school history teacher at a school in DeKalb County, and she had inherited from me what I can only describe as an allergic reaction to dishonesty. Her students either loved her fiercely or found her exhausting. There was no middle ground. She lived in a small apartment in East Atlanta. She called me every Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock without fail to talk about her week. We talked about her students, about what she was cooking, about whatever she'd been reading. She called me Mom in a way that still made me feel young. Tanya was not greedy, but Tanya had one weakness that her brother knew exactly how to use. She loved him. She had always looked up to Darnell the way younger siblings sometimes do with an older brother, who was for many years genuinely worth admiring. She did not want to believe badly of him. She was in that particular way what you might call trusting to a fault. Sometime in the summer of 2023, I would later piece together the exact timeline Darnell called Tanya and asked her for what he described as a routine favor. He said he was helping me update some banking paperwork, the kind of administrative housekeeping that widows often need to do to make accounts easier to manage. He said he just needed her to sign a witness form confirming that she was a member of the family standard procedure. He told her nothing complicated. He sent her a document. She signed it without reading it carefully. She mailed it back. What she signed was a witness identification and acknowledgement form, a document drafted by a man named Gerald Marsh, a private attorney based in Marietta. It was designed to accompany a fraudulent power of attorney that named Darnell as my sole financial representative. Tanya's signature gave the package an appearance of family legitimacy. It made it look like the family was aware. It made it look like everyone was on board. Tanya did not know any of this. What Darnell told her was not what the document actually was. Her signature carried no legal authority to authorize anything on my behalf. A power of attorney can only be signed by the principal herself, meaning me. But in the world of banking, a family witness signature alongside a notarized power of attorney had a softening effect. It reduced scrutiny. It made tellers less likely to ask hard questions. It would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation, not because of what Tanya did wrong, but because of how it proved what Darnell did. In December of 2023, my neighbor Dorothy Hines knocked on my front door on a Wednesday afternoon. Dorothy was 70 years old, sharp-eyed, and had lived next door to me for 11 years. We were not close friends in the way that some neighbors become close friends, but we had the comfortable, reliable warmth of two women who had shared a fence line long enough to trust each other. She brought me tomatoes from her garden in the summer. I brought her cornbread at Thanksgiving. She stood on my porch that December afternoon with her hands clasped in front of her and a look on her face that I recognized immediately, the look of someone who has decided to say something that they know might be unwelcome. "Helen," she said, "I don't want to get into your business, and I'm not one to carry tales, but there was a man here last week. He knocked on your door, and when you didn't answer, he came over and knocked on mine. He said he was a family representative looking at the property on behalf of the owners." She paused. "He asked me how long you'd lived here, whether you were home much, whether the neighborhood was quiet. The kind of questions a buyer's agent asks. Except you never told me you were thinking about selling." I thanked Dorothy. I told her I appreciated her telling me. I closed the front door, walked to the armchair by the living room window. The chair that had been Robert's, the one I had kept exactly where he'd left it, and I sat down and did not move for the better part of an hour. I thought about what Dorothy had said. I thought about Darnell's questions over the past 2 years. I thought about Brianna's casual inventory of the house's market value. I thought about the feeling I had carried low and persistent ever since Robert's warning, that particular feeling that is not yet certainty, but is no longer nothing. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, opened the drawer beneath the table, and took out the small blue notebook. There were 11 pages of notes inside. Dates, conversations, questions I had written in red pen and circled when the answer had not yet come to me. I turned to a blank page and wrote the date at the top. Then I wrote, "Something is already in motion. Find out what." 2 days later, I called Raymond Okafor. Raymond had been my accountant for 15 years. He was a meticulous man, Nigerian-American, 50 years old, with a quiet precision that Robert had trusted completely and that I had come to rely on absolutely. He had prepared our taxes, managed our investment accounts, and reviewed our insurance policies every year without fail, and in 15 years he had never once made an error that I could find. I told him I needed him to look at everything, every account, every transaction going back 18 months. I told him I needed him to be discreet, that this was not something I was ready to discuss with anyone else, and that I needed him to treat it that way. He did not ask why. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mrs. Washington, I'll go through it all. Give me a week. There's a great deal to look at, and I want to be thorough." I thanked him and put down the phone, and I waited. Raymond called me back on the evening of Friday, January 5th, 2024. I was sitting in the living room with the television on one of those nature documentaries I keep on in the background when I need the house to feel less quiet. The phone rang at exactly 7:42. I know because I looked at the clock on the mantel when I heard it. Some part of me had been watching that clock for 2 days. I recognized something in Raymond's voice the moment he said my name. In 15 years, I had never heard him sound quite like that. Careful, weighted. The voice of a man who has found something he was hoping not to find. "Mrs. Washington," he said, "I need to walk you through what I've found, and I want to ask you some questions as I go, if that's all right." I told him to go ahead. On September 14th of last year, 2023, there was a withdrawal of $47,000 from your joint savings account, the one that still carries both your name and Mr. Washington's. I said nothing. I waited. The transaction was processed using a power of attorney document. The POA names Darnell Robert Washington as your authorized financial representative. The room felt very still suddenly. The documentary kept playing something about ocean tides, but the sound seemed far away. "Raymond," I said, "I have never signed a power of attorney for Darnell. Not for any account. Not for anything." A pause. "I know, which is why I pulled a copy of the document from the bank's records. Mrs. Washington, I've been looking at your signature on file for 15 years. The signature on this power of attorney is not yours." I set down the glass of water I had been holding and placed both hands flat on my knees. My son had forged my signature, not borrowed money without asking, not made a mistake in judgment, not done something careless or thoughtless. He had sat down, taken a pen, and written my name on a legal document in order to steal from me. That is what forgery is. That is the specific, deliberate, premeditated act it requires. I did not speak for what must have been 10 seconds. Raymond waited without filling the silence, which is one of the things I have always respected about him. "Is there more?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "There is a second transaction, November 8th, 2023. $23,500 from a small investment account, the one you opened in 2015 for the rental property reserves. Same mechanism. Same power of attorney document. So $70,500 total. That's what's gone so far. Yes, ma'am. So far. 2 small words that carried the weight of everything that had not yet happened. I asked him to give me until morning and to keep all of it, every document, every record, locked and private. He said he would. We hung up. I sat in Robert's chair for a long time after that. The documentary ended and another one started, and I did not move. I thought about September 14th, a Thursday. As it turned out, I later checked the calendar. I thought about what I had been doing on that particular Thursday in September. Probably teaching my volunteer reading group at the community center. Probably making dinner for one. Probably calling Tanya on a Tuesday 2 days earlier, talking about her students, not knowing that somewhere across this city, a document bearing a forged version of my name was being handed across a bank counter. I thought about Robert. Be careful with Darnell. He had known something. He had not known this. No one could have known this, but he had felt the direction of the wind before the storm arrived, the way certain people can. He had tried to tell me, and I had listened and watched and written things down in a blue notebook, and still it had happened. $70,500. I pressed my palms against my eyes. I breathed. And then I stood up and went to bed because I had learned long ago that there are problems you cannot think your way through in a single night, and that sleep, real sleep, even a few hours, is not weakness. It is preparation. Raymond came to my kitchen table on Monday morning, January 8th, with a leather portfolio and 14 printed pages. He had spent the weekend going deeper. What he laid out before me over the next 2 hours was not just a record of what had been taken. It was a blueprint. It was a plan. And the plan was far larger than $70,500. He walked me through it step by step, and as he spoke, I wrote in the blue notebook and did not let my face show what I was feeling. Step 1 had begun in June of 2023. Brianna had engaged a private attorney named Gerald Marsh, based in Marietta, Georgia. Marsh was not my attorney. He had no relationship with me whatsoever. His role, Raymond explained, was to prepare a legal package, the kind that at first glance resembles routine estate planning. The package included 2 core documents. First, a comprehensive power of attorney transferring full financial authority over my accounts and assets to Darnell. Second, a revised last will and testament that would, upon my death, direct the overwhelming majority of my estate to Darnell, leaving Tanya a fraction of what she would have received under my existing will. Neither document had been signed by me. The power of attorney carried a forged signature. The revised will, as far as Raymond could determine, had never been presented to me at all. It was, he believed, being held in reserve. Step 2 came in August. Darnell had called Tanya and asked her to sign a witness identification and acknowledgement form, which he described as a routine administrative document to help the bank process paperwork on my behalf. Tanya signed. She mailed it back. She thought nothing of it. What she had actually signed was the witness attestation page attached to the fraudulent power of attorney package. Her signature didn't grant Darnell any authority legally, only I could do that. But it gave the package a surface legitimacy. A bank teller looking at a notarized power of attorney accompanied by a signed family witness form is far less likely to pause, far less likely to call and verify, far less likely to ask the question that might have stopped everything. Step 3 was September 14th. Using the forged power of attorney, Darnell walked into a branch of our bank and withdrew $47,000 from the joint savings account. The funds were transferred to a limited liability company called Caldwell Property Solutions, LLC. The LLC had been registered in Delaware in July 2023, 6 weeks before the first withdrawal. It was registered under Brianna's name. Step 4, the one that had not yet happened, the one they were building toward, was the Decatur property. Raymond set down a separate page. Mrs. Washington Brianna Caldwell has been in contact with at least 2 real estate investment companies operating in the Atlanta metro area. She has represented herself in these communications as your authorized agent. She has been pursuing an off-market sale of the Glenwood Avenue property. The Decatur building. Yes, ma'am. Current estimated market value $340,000. The offer she was negotiating as of early January was $298,000 below market fast. Close no public listing. I looked at him. When was she trying to close on A? He set down one more page. A printed email chain obtained through what Raymond would only describe as a contact at one of the investment firms. A contact who had grown uncomfortable with how the transaction was being structured and had reached out to Raymond after recognizing his name on some of the account documentation. The target closing date was January 31st, 2024. I looked at the date on Raymond's papers. January 8th, 23 days. Raymond let me sit with that number. He was good at knowing when not to speak. "There's one more thing," he said after a moment. He turned to the last page. When I traced the transaction history of Caldwell Property Solutions, LLC, I found something that bothered me. The LLC was brand new, registered July 2023, but its financial activity pattern looked practiced. The structure, the layering, the speed of the transfers. It didn't look like a first attempt. He paused. "I think they may have done this before, with someone else. I don't have a name yet, but I'm looking." I opened the blue notebook. I wrote 4 words and circled them in red. Who came before me? I did not know, sitting at that table on a cold Monday morning in January, that those 4 words would become one of the most important questions in the entire story. I did not know yet what the answer would be or what it would mean. I only knew that the number on the page in front of me was not just $70,500. If Darnell and Brianna completed what they had started, the total damage would exceed $410,500. And that assumed they stopped at the Decatur property. It did not account for the investment portfolio. It did not account for the retirement accounts. It did not account for this house on Waverly Lane where Robert and I had stood at the kitchen window with sparkling cider and said nobody can ever put us out. Everything we had built, everything we had decided dollar by dollar and year by year and sacrifice by sacrifice. All of it was in their sights. 23 days. I want to be precise about something because I think it matters. To understand how I knew I need to go back further to the months before Raymond's call, before Dorothy, before any of it came into focus. I did not catch my son because I am clever with technology. I do not know how to trace financial transactions or analyze LLC structures. I caught him, or began to, because of 3 specific things that happened in the months before Raymond's call, and because 35 years of teaching 3rd grade had given me a particular kind of patience. The first sign came in October of 2023. Darnell arrived at my door on a Sunday afternoon with a manila folder and a pen already uncapped. He said he'd been working with a financial planner who recommended that I update my estate documents, just routine maintenance. He said the kind of thing widows often put off. He set the folder on the kitchen table and started explaining the contents quickly, the way you explain something when you don't want the other person to read it closely. 35 years of watching children take tests taught me exactly what that looks like. The slightly too fast voice. The pen placed within reach before the question is even asked. The careful avoidance of eye contact with the document itself. I said, "Leave it with me overnight, sweetheart. You know I don't sign anything I haven't read twice." He smiled. Something moved behind his eyes that was not a smile. He said, "Of course, take all the time I needed." He left without the folder. That night I read every page 3 times. Then I walked to the drugstore 2 blocks away and photocopied the entire thing at the self-service machine for 73 cents. The next morning I returned the originals to Darnell and told him I wanted to run it by my attorney first. He said that was fine. He said there was no rush. He did not come back for the folder for 11 days. When he did, I gave it back without comment and he took it without pressing. The second sign came in November. I have reviewed my own bank statements on the first Saturday of every month since Robert and I opened our first joint account in 1986. It is a habit so old I do not think of it as a habit anymore. It is simply what I do on the first Saturday of the month, the way I water the plants on Wednesdays and call Tanya on Tuesdays. In November, I found a withdrawal I did not recognize. $23,500, marked as authorized transaction, processed by designated representative. I called the bank. The representative told me the transaction had been processed with a valid power of attorney on file. I asked for a copy of that document. The representative said it would take 10 to 14 business days. I said that was fine. I noted the date of my request in the blue notebook. 14 days later, the copy arrived in the mail. I sat at the kitchen table with it and my reading glasses, and I looked at the signature on the last page, the signature that was supposed to be mine. Whoever had signed it had studied my handwriting. The letter forms were close. The loop of the H, the slight leftward lean of the letters, they had paid attention. But the pressure was wrong. I signed my name with a particular firmness on the first letter and a lighter touch on the rest. This signature was uniformly light, even and controlled like someone being careful. My signature is not careful. After 63 years, my name comes out of my hand the way breathing comes out of my body. This was not my signature. I put the document in the blue notebook. The third sign was Dorothy Hines and the man who called himself a family representative. 3 pieces, 3 data points. A third-grade teacher knows that you do not accuse a child based on one thing you noticed. You wait until the pattern is undeniable. You collect, you document. You wait for certainty before you move. By December, I had certainty. When Raymond left my house on Monday the 8th of January, I closed the door and stood in my entry hall for a moment, the 14 pages in my hands, the blue notebook under my arm. I did not call Gloria Simmons my attorney, though I had already decided I would call her the next morning. I did not call Tanya. I did not sit down and make a list, which is what I usually do when something requires planning. Instead, I put on my coat, the heavy gray one that had been hanging on the hook by the door since November, and I went out into the back garden. It was cold. January in Atlanta is not the brutal cold of the north, but it settles into you differently, damp and gray and close. The garden was bare. The rose bushes were cut back to stubs. The ornamental grasses had gone brown. And the azaleas. Robert had planted the largest of them, the Formosa azalea coral pink, in the spring of 1999 against the back fence between the old oak and the garden shed. It bloomed in April so extravagantly, it looked almost irresponsible. He had told me the day he put it in the ground that azaleas don't die in winter. They go dormant. They pull everything they have down into the root system and they wait. All the work is underground, he'd said, patting the soil around the base with his hand. You just can't see it. Standing in front of that bush on a January morning, leafless and gray and absolutely still, I thought about my husband. I thought about what he had built and what he had asked me to protect and what I had been watching unravel for months without yet knowing how bad it was. And for the first time since Robert died, not the first time I had cried, but the first time I had cried for this particular reason, I stood in the cold garden and I wept. Not for the money. The money was a problem to be solved, and I already knew in the marrow of my bones that I was going to solve it. I wept because of what the money represented, because of the specific cruelty of having your own child look at everything you gave him, the education, the Sunday dinners, the years of putting his needs ahead of your own, and decide that the most valuable thing about you was what he could take when you weren't looking. There is a grief that has no name. It is the grief of recognizing someone you love as a person you do not know. It is not the same as losing them. It is in some ways harder. I gave myself 3 minutes. I know that sounds precise, almost cold, but it is how I have always worked through pain that I cannot afford to be swallowed by. 3 minutes to feel it fully, to not push it away or manage it or put it somewhere for later. Just 3 minutes of standing in the cold in front of Robert's azalea and letting the truth of what was happening move through me without flinching. Then I wiped my face with the hem of my coat. I looked at that bare gray bush one more time at its roots, which went deep and held even in January, even when there was nothing to show for it above the ground. And I went inside. I poured a cup of coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the blue notebook to a fresh page and uncapped the red pen. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 lines: what I know, what I need, what I will do, and I began. I woke up on Tuesday, January 9th at 5:30 in the morning. This was not unusual. I have woken at 5:30 every weekday for the better part of 40 years, a habit formed in the years when I needed to be at school by 7:30 and had a household to manage before I left. The alarm clock has been unnecessary for decades. My body simply knows. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked out at the garden, the same garden I had stood in the evening before, coatless now against the cold glass, watching the sky go from black to the particular dark gray of a January Atlanta dawn. The azaleas were still there. Of course they were. I poured my cup and sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the blue notebook to the page where I had written 3 headings the night before: what I know, what I need, what I will do. I had filled the first section. I had started the second. Now I turned to the third. I wrote 3 rules at the top of a fresh page. Not instructions, not a to-do list. Rules the kind that govern how you conduct yourself when everything around you is trying to pull you into chaos. Rule 1. Darnell does not know that I know. Not yet. Not until it is too late for him to undo anything. Rule 2. Every step I take will be legal. Fully, completely, documentably legal. I am not interested in revenge. I am interested in correction. Rule 3. Protect Tanya. She was used. She is not guilty of what he is guilty of. Whatever happens, she does not get hurt by this, if I can prevent it. I read the 3 rules back to myself. Then I said them out loud quietly in my empty kitchen, the way I used to read lesson plans aloud before a school day began, because saying something out loud makes it real in a way that writing it does not. Then I picked up my phone and called Gloria Simmons. I had known attorney Gloria Simmons for 11 years since she joined our congregation at Greater Salem Baptist. She was 55 years old, a graduate of Howard University School of Law, and for 25 years she had built one of the most respected estate planning practices in Atlanta. She was precise, direct, and completely without sentimentality about the law, which was exactly what I needed. I did not call her office. I called her cell phone, which she had given me years ago with the instruction that I was to use it for anything that genuinely couldn't wait. I told her I needed to meet with her that day in person and not at her office. I told her it was serious. She said, "Name a place." We met at a coffee shop in Sandy Springs, far enough from Buckhead that I was unlikely to encounter anyone I knew, and far enough from Gloria's downtown office that no one would connect the meeting to anything professional. I chose a corner table near the back. I arrived 15 minutes early. I ordered a plain coffee and sat with my coat still on the photocopied documents in a manila folder on my lap. When Gloria came in, she didn't make a production of looking around or being discreet. She simply walked to my table, sat down, ordered a coffee from the server, and said, "Show me." I laid out everything on the table between us. The photocopied power of attorney package, Raymond's 14-page report, the bank statement with the flagged transactions, the copy of the forged signature alongside a sample of my actual signature that I had written out that morning on a plain sheet of paper. She read without speaking. She did not exclaim. She did not shake her head dramatically. She simply read carefully the way lawyers read, which is to say with a stillness that is not calm but is concentration. After 20 minutes, she set the last page down, picked up her coffee, and looked at me directly. "Helen," she said, "what they've done here is a felony. Forgery of a legal instrument, financial fraud, wire fraud if the money crossed state lines to that LLC in Delaware, which it did. This is not a civil matter. This is criminal." I said I understood. I want you to understand something else. You have every right to walk into a police station today and file a report. You could do that this afternoon. And given what Raymond found, there would almost certainly be an arrest within days. She smiled not warmly, but with recognition. But if you do that before your assets are properly protected, you give them a window. The moment Darnell knows there's an investigation, whatever they haven't yet moved becomes a flight risk. Money moves fast, Helen. Property takes longer, but not as long as you'd think. I want everything locked down first, I said. Every account, every property. I want it all protected before a single person in that family hears so much as a rumor that something is wrong. Then I want to hand the authorities the cleanest, most complete package of evidence they have ever seen. Gloria looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "All right, here's what we're going to do, and here's the order we're going to do it in." She pulled out a yellow legal pad. The first item, invalidate the fraudulent power of attorney immediately. Gloria would issue formal written notice to every financial institution holding accounts in my name, our bank, the investment firm, the retirement account administrator, that any power of attorney purporting to name Darnell Robert Washington as my authorized representative was fraudulent, had not been executed by me, and was to be treated as void effective that day, January 9th, 2024. No transactions of any amount were to be processed based on that document. The second item placed fraud alerts on every account. This was a standard protective measure that banks could implement immediately and that would flag any attempted transaction for additional manual review. The third item, transfer the Decatur rental property into a living trust. A living trust meant that the property was no longer titled directly in my name. It belonged to a trust of which I was the sole trustee and beneficiary during my lifetime. To sell a property held in a living trust, you needed the trustee's signature. Mine, in person, at a notary. There was no power of attorney in existence, fraudulent or otherwise, that could override that requirement. The Decatur building, once in the trust, could not be sold without me standing in a room and personally signing the transfer documents. The fourth item, draft a new will. We'll talk about the will separately, Gloria said. I want you to have thought about it clearly before we do. Don't tell me today what you want in it. Think about it tonight, and we'll meet at my office on Friday. I nodded. Then she said one more thing. The attorney who prepared this package, Gerald Marsh in Marietta. I want to run his name through the state bar database before we go any further. She picked up her phone and typed something. She waited. She read what came up on her screen. The expression on her face did not change much, but something shifted, a very slight tightening around her eyes that told me the information was not neutral. She turned the phones around and placed it on the table between us. I read the entry from the State Bar of Georgia's Public Disciplinary Records. Gerald T. Marsh, licensed to practice law in the state of Georgia, suspended effective March 14, 2023. Grounds: misrepresentation of client interests, unauthorized use of client funds, preparation of fraudulent legal instruments in an unrelated estate matter. Reinstatement proceedings pending. I set the phone down. He's been suspended since March, Gloria said. 9 months before the first withdrawal from your account. Everything he prepared, the power of attorney, the witness documentation package, all of it was drafted by a man who had no legal authority to practice law in this state. The documents were invalid the moment they were created. I thought about that for a moment. Darnell knew, I said. It was not a question. He had to, Gloria said. A legitimate attorney would not prepare a fraudulent power of attorney with a forged signature. The only attorney who would agree to do this was one who had nothing left to lose professionally. Someone already suspended someone operating outside the system with no license to protect and no bar association looking over his shoulder. She paused. Your son didn't just decide to steal from you. He went looking for someone willing to help him do it. And he found exactly that person. I sat with that for a moment. There are things you learn about someone you love that you can never unlearn. You cannot unfind what Raymond found in that 14-page report. You cannot unsee what is on a state bar disciplinary record. You cannot unknow the premeditation, the months of planning the deliberate search for a suspended attorney, the careful assembly of a scheme designed to leave no obvious trace. I had known in December that something was wrong. I had known by January 8th that it was worse than I had feared. But sitting in that coffee shop on January 9th reading a state bar record on Gloria Simmons's phone, I understood for the first time the full shape of what my son had chosen to become. I folded that understanding up and placed it somewhere private. I would take it out later when there was time, when this was over, when I could afford to sit with what it meant. Not now. "What's next?" I said. Gloria flipped to the next page of her legal pad. On Thursday, January 11th, I drove to Raymond's office in Midtown. He had been working since Monday. The 14 pages had become 22 printed and organized into a tabbed folder that he placed on the conference table between us, with the particular precision of a man who knows that the order of information matters. He walked me through what he had found starting from the beginning. The $47,000 withdrawn in September had traveled in a straight line from my joint savings account into Caldwell Property Solutions, LLC. The Delaware company registered in Brianna's name in July 2023, and from there into a business account at a bank in the Cayman Islands. It had been there since September. It had not moved again. "They were holding it," Raymond said, "waiting for the larger transaction to complete before moving anything." The $23,500 withdrawn in November had taken a different route into a personal checking account under Darnell's name at a different bank, and from there withdrawn in cash over 3 visits, each withdrawal just under the federal reporting threshold of $10,000. The cash was gone. No trail. "He knew the reporting rules," I said. "He did," Raymond said. The withdrawals were structured specifically to avoid triggering a currency transaction report. That's called structuring. It's a federal offense on its own. He moved to the next tab. This was the section about Peachtree Quick Sale, the real estate investment company that Brianna had been negotiating with to purchase the Decatur property. Raymond had a contact there. He would not tell me who, only that the contact had grown uncomfortable with the transaction when certain questions about title and authorization couldn't be answered cleanly, and had reached out to Raymond after recognizing his name on documents Brianna had submitted as part of the due diligence package. The contract Brianna had signed on January 3rd, 4 days before I called Raymond, committed to a sale price of $298,000, significantly below the property's estimated market value of $340,000. The discount was the price of speed. The contract required closing within 30 days. Raymond tapped the contract date with one finger and counted forward. "January 31st, he said. "That's the closing deadline, which means as of today, January 11th, there are 20 days left." I looked at him across the conference table. "Gloria has already begun the living trust transfer," I said. "How long will it take to complete?" "If she filed the paperwork this week, the deed transfer should be recorded at the county clerk's office within 5 to 7 business days. Once it's recorded, the property is no longer in your name. It's in the trust. At that point, Brianna's contract is void. She has no authority to sell property that doesn't exist in the name she's claiming to represent." "And Peachtree Quick Sale. I'll contact them directly," Raymond said. "I'll send them a formal letter from Gloria's office confirming that you, the actual property owner, did not authorize this transaction and that the signatory had no legal standing. A legitimate investment company is not going to close on a property with a contested title. The liability alone would stop them." He set down his pen. "Mrs. Washington, I want you to understand something clearly. Everything I just described, the trust transfer, the letter to Peachtree, the fraud alerts on the bank accounts, all of that addresses what they haven't done yet. It stops the bleeding going forward, but it doesn't recover what's already gone. The $70,500. Yes, that money is in a Cayman Islands account and in withdrawn cash. Recovering it through civil means would require litigation that could take years. The faster path, and frankly the more certain path, is for law enforcement to freeze the LLC's accounts as part of a criminal investigation. He paused. Which means at some point this has to go to the authorities. I know, I said, but not yet. Not until everything is locked. Raymond nodded. He understood. He had understood from the first phone call without needing it, explained that I was not a woman who moved before she was ready. He closed the folder and slid it across the table to me. There's one more thing I've been looking into, he said. That question you wrote in your notebook about whether Caldwell Property Solutions had been used before. I've been running the LLC's transaction history as far back as I can access. He paused. I haven't found a name yet, but there's something in the early transaction pattern that doesn't fit the timeline. The company was registered in July 2023, but the account structure, the offshore layering the way the receiving accounts were set up, that takes time to arrange. Weeks, sometimes months if you don't know what you're doing, which suggests that either they planned this much further in advance than we know, or he stopped, or they've done something like this before, I said. With someone else, with someone who didn't catch it. That's what I'm trying to find out, he said quietly. I opened the blue notebook. I turned to the page where I had written who came before me and circled it in red. I looked at it for a moment. Then I underlined it. Keep looking, I said. Gloria's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street, and on Friday morning, January 12th, I rode the elevator up in my good coat, the navy wool one I wore to church, and to meetings that mattered with a manila folder under my arm, and a clarity in my mind that I had not felt in months. The clarity had come overnight. Gloria had told me on Tuesday to think carefully about what I wanted in the new will, and I had done exactly that. Not anxiously, not in the restless half-sleep way of someone who cannot let a problem rest, but deliberately. I had sat in Robert's chair on Tuesday evening with a legal pad and thought through every piece of what we had built together, and by the time I went to bed, I knew exactly what I wanted and why. Gloria met me at the door of her conference room herself. Her assistant brought coffee. We sat across from each other at the long table, and Gloria slid a draft across to me, 12 pages clean type, every clause precise. I read it from the first line to the last without speaking. Gloria did not rush me. She refilled my coffee once. Outside the window, Atlanta moved 14 floors below traffic and construction, and the ordinary business of a Friday morning, indifferent to what was happening in this room. When I finished, I set the draft down and told her what I wanted to change. The house on Waverly Lane, the Buckhead house, the one Robert and I had carried into existence, brick by payment by year, would go to Tanya. Not outright, but with a condition she would need to live in it for at least 5 years before she could sell. I did not want it flipped. I did not want it liquidated. I wanted Tanya to have the chance to know what it felt like to be rooted somewhere, to have a house that was hers and no one else's paid for, and settled and solid. If she chose to sell it after 5 years, that was her right. But I wanted her to try living in it first. The Decatur rental property, the Glenwood Avenue building that Robert and I had bought in 2005 that had put both children through college and then kept on giving, would go into a charitable living trust administered by Greater Salem Baptist Church. The rental income after maintenance and taxes would fund annual scholarships for Black students from low-income households in the Atlanta area who were the first in their families to attend a 4-year university. The way I had been. The way a scholarship had made possible everything that came after. The investment portfolio would be divided 2/3 to Tanya outright and $60,000 to a named recipient listed in a sealed addendum that I handed to Gloria in a separate envelope. She did not open it. She did not ask about it. She simply placed it in the file. The retirement accounts I would manage myself for the remainder of my life. What remained at my death would pass to Tanya and Darnell. Gloria looked up from her notes when we reached this section. She waited. Darnell receives nothing, I said. Not the house, not the investment accounts, not a single dollar from any asset I hold. The one exception if he returns in full in certified funds the $70,500 that was taken from my accounts with written documentation acknowledged by my attorney and my accountant before December 31st, 2024, then he receives a portion to be determined at that time. I paused. That is not a punishment. That is a door. Whether he walks through it is his decision. Gloria wrote it down exactly as I had said it. She did not editorialize. When the final version was ready, 2 hours later, properly witnessed, properly notarized, signed by me in ink on every page, she placed it in a fireproof document safe in her office and sent a copy electronically to a secure server and a third copy by courier to a safe deposit box at my bank where it was placed under the joint custody of my name and hers. It existed in 3 places simultaneously. It could not be lost, stolen, altered, or suppressed. I walked out of Gloria's building into the January afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The air was cold and smelled faintly of exhaust and coffee from the shop on the corner. I buttoned my coat. When I signed that will, I felt something I had not expected to feel: relief. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly. Relief, the specific physical sensation of a weight being set down after you have carried it so long that you forgot it was there. For the first time since December, since Dorothy had told me about the man at my door, since Raymond had called on a Friday evening with that careful, weighted voice for the first time in weeks, I knew that what Robert and I had built was safe. Not because of luck, not because I had trusted the right people, because I had chosen to protect it, because I had sat in a cold garden and wept for 3 minutes and then gone back inside and picked up a pen. I walked to my car. I had a Sunday dinner to plan. I want to tell you something about those 2 weeks in January, the 2 weeks between the day I signed the will and the day everything came apart for Darnell and Brianna. On the outside, my life looked exactly the same. I went to church on Sundays. I attended my volunteer reading group at the community center on Wednesday mornings. I called Tanya every Tuesday evening. I watered the plants, returned library books, bought groceries, and kept the house the way I had always kept it: clean, ordered, and warm. Darnell did not know. Brianna did not know. To everyone looking in from the outside, Helen Mae Washington was a 63-year-old widow going about her ordinary life in January, slow and careful and unremarkable. This was deliberate. And it was without question the hardest thing I did throughout the entire 4 weeks. On Sunday, January 14th, I cooked dinner. I made braised chicken thighs with garlic and thyme, Robert's favorite, the dish I had made every Sunday for 30 years because he said it made the house smell like home. I made a pan of cornbread from scratch the way my mother had taught me in a cast-iron skillet with a crust on the bottom that crackled when you cut it. I made collard greens with smoked turkey low and slow the way they need to be done. Darnell and Brianna arrived at 6. Tanya came a few minutes after. I had set the table with the good placemats, the ones with the blue border because Sunday dinner at my house had always used the good placemats, and I was not going to change that. We sat down. We said grace. We passed the food around the table. Brianna smiled more than usual. She complimented the chicken, asked about the cornbread recipe, mentioned something about a property she had listed in Alpharetta. I listened and responded and smiled and refilled glasses and gave nothing away. Halfway through the meal, Darnell set down his fork and looked at me in the careful, studied, casual way that I had come to recognize over the past several months. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to check, did you ever get a chance to look over those documents I left with you? The estate planning stuff, my financial guy is asking about the timeline." His financial guy, not Gerald Marsh, suspended attorney. His financial guy. I looked at my son across the table where he had eaten 1,000 meals. I thought about the September afternoon when he had walked into a bank and handed over a document with a forged version of my name on it. I thought about the phone calls Raymond had traced. I thought about the Delaware LLC and the Cayman Islands account and the $23,500 he had taken in structured cash withdrawals to avoid federal reporting requirements. I smiled at him the way I had smiled at 35 years' worth of third graders who had turned in work they thought I hadn't noticed was copied. "I'm still thinking it through, sweetheart," I said. "You know I don't rush these things. I want to make sure I do it right." He nodded. Brianna took a sip of her iced tea. "Of course," he said, "no rush." We finished dinner. Tanya helped me clear the plates. Darnell and Brianna put on their coats and said their goodbyes at the front door, and I hugged my son and told him to drive safe, and I watched their car reverse out of my driveway and disappear around the corner. I closed the front door. I stood in the entry hall for a moment with my hand still on the knob. In the kitchen, I could hear Tanya running water rinsing dishes the way she always did automatically, without being asked the way people do when a kitchen is genuinely home to them. "Mama," she said from the kitchen doorway. She had not called me Mama since she was about 10 years old. "Is something wrong? You seemed, I don't know, different tonight." I looked at my daughter. She was standing in the light from the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, and her face had that particular expression she gets when she is trying to decide whether to push or let something rest, the expression she had worn since she was 7 years old and the most observant child I had ever taught. She had gotten that look from me. I recognized it completely. I made my decision in less than a second. "Nothing's wrong, baby," I said. "I'm just tired. It's been a long week." She held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded and went back to the dishes. I went to the living room and sat in Robert's chair in the dark with only the street light coming through the curtains, and I thought about what it had cost me to say that. To look my daughter in the face. My daughter who had done nothing wrong, who had been used as a tool by her own brother, and tell her that nothing was wrong when everything was wrong. But Tanya was still talking to Darnell every week. Tanya did not know how to hide what she felt. And if I told her that night, with 7 days left on the Peachtree quick sale deadline and the GBI investigation not yet formally opened, the risk was too high. One unguarded moment. One call to Darnell where something in her voice was off. One text message read over someone's shoulder. I needed 7 more days. I could give Tanya the truth in 7 days. I sat in Robert's chair and listened to my daughter finish the dishes and say goodnight and lock the front door behind her, and I thought, this is the price of strategy. You pay it with the people you are trying to protect. On Monday morning, January 15th, Gloria called me at 8 o'clock. When she had filed the formal complaint about the fraudulent power of attorney with the Georgia Secretary of State's office the previous week, a flag had been generated in the state's legal document monitoring system. Gerald Marsh's name had triggered it, because Gerald Marsh's name had appeared before. Twice, Gloria said, in the past 18 months. 2 other fraudulent estate document packages, both involving forged signatures, both targeting widowed women over 60 in the greater Atlanta area. Both cases were flagged, but neither resulted in prosecution because the victims or their families declined to pursue charges. I was quiet for a moment. "They were scared," I said. "Or they didn't know what they had," Gloria said. "Or both." But Helen, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, already has an open file on Gerald Marsh. A special agent named Carla Nguyen has been building a case for several months. When I filed our complaint, it landed on her desk within 24 hours. She called me yesterday. "What does she want?" "She wants to meet with you. She wants your documentation. And she believes, based on what I described, that your case is the most complete evidentiary record she has seen on Marsh and anyone operating with him." I thought about this. When do they plan to move? That depends on how quickly we can get her everything she needs. She's talking about 10 to 14 days. "I want advance notice before anything happens," I said. "Before any arrests, before any search warrants are executed, I need to know. I have to tell Tanya before she hears it any other way." Gloria said she would make sure of it. I thanked her and put down the phone. I made a second cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden. And I thought about something I had been carrying since Sunday. Something that had come back to me during dinner, watching Darnell across the table, thinking about how far in advance all of this had been planned. There was a detail I had not yet told Gloria or Raymond. I had held it back not because I meant to, but because I had not yet understood its full significance. 3 months earlier, in October, before the dinner where Darnell had brought the document folder before any of the formal machinery of the scheme had touched me directly, Darnell had paid a visit to Greater Salem Baptist Church. He had met with Pastor Elijah Brooks. I knew this because Elijah told me. Not immediately. He told me the following Friday, January 19th, when I came to the church to use the copy machine in the church office, and he appeared in the doorway of his study with a look on his face that I recognized as the look of a man who has been holding something and has decided the time has come to put it down. "Helen," he said, "can you come in and sit for a minute?" Elijah Brooks had known our family for 30 years. He had married Robert and me in this church. He had stood at Robert's graveside on a cold November morning in 2019 and spoken about a man who built bridges in every sense of that word. He was 67 years old, careful with words, and almost constitutionally incapable of being unkind. He told me what Darnell had said to him in October. Darnell had come in the afternoon on a weekday without an appointment and asked Elijah whether he had noticed any changes in me recently, whether I seemed confused at times, whether I had moments of disorientation or forgetfulness, whether in Elijah's pastoral judgment I seemed to be fully myself. He framed it as a son's concern. He said he had been reading about early onset cognitive decline and that he worried I might be showing signs. He asked whether Elijah thought it might be time for someone to step in and help manage my affairs for my own protection. Elijah had told him he had seen nothing of the kind, that I was sharper than most people half my age, that I ran the women's Bible study with the same precision I had always brought to it, and had recently led a committee meeting that ran 11 items in 90 minutes without losing the thread of a single one. Darnell had thanked him and left. Elijah had not told me right away because he genuinely thought it was a son's worry, misguided perhaps, but not malicious. He had filed it away as one of the stranger pastoral visits he'd had in recent memory and moved on. But sitting across from me in his study on a January Friday, having listened to everything I had just told him about the power of attorney and the forged signature and the LLC and the Cayman Islands account, Pastor Brooks understood what he had actually witnessed in October. A rehearsal. If the financial scheme was ever discovered, if a bank flagged something or a lawyer got involved, and here was the move if I tried to fight back. Darnell had been preparing the ground for a fallback position. A widowed woman who seemed confused. A concerned son who had spoken to her pastor. A petition for legal guardianship citing cognitive decline, which would give Darnell the legal authority to make financial decisions on my behalf and strip me of the power to contest them. The forgery was Plan A. The guardianship was Plan B. I sat in Elijah's office and let that land. The full weight of it. The specific architectural coldness of having planned not just how to take what he wanted, but how to neutralize me if I tried to stop him. I looked at Elijah and I said, "Will you put it in writing?" "What he said to you that day, the exact words, as precisely as you remember them." "I already did," he said quietly. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and produced 2 pages handwritten in his careful, deliberate script, and dated October 16th, 2023, the day after Darnell's visit. At the top, he had written Personal Memorandum Pastoral Record filed for accuracy. "I wrote it down the next morning," he said. "I didn't know why. Something about the conversation stayed with me. It didn't feel like worry. It felt like something else." He looked at me steadily. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." "You're telling me now," I said. "That's what matters." Both documents, Elijah's personal memorandum from October and his notarized statement attesting to my full cognitive and communicative capacity over the preceding 3 months, went into the evidence package that Gloria's office delivered to Special Agent Carla Nguyen the following week. Every door Darnell had thought he might use was now closed, locked from the inside. By me. Between January 16th and January 20th, 2024, while Darnell and Brianna went about their ordinary lives working, driving, eating dinner, sleeping, the ground beneath them was shifting in ways they could not yet see or feel. That is the nature of consequence. It does not announce itself. It assembles quietly piece by piece in offices and filing systems and legal databases, and by the time it becomes visible, it has already been true for some time. On Tuesday, January 16th, Raymond sent a formal letter on Gloria Simmons's letterhead to Peachtree Quick Sale Investment Group, LLC. The letter was precise and unambiguous. The individual who had signed a purchase contract on January 3rd purporting to represent the owner of the Glenwood Avenue property in Decatur, 1. Brianna Caldwell had no legal authority to do so. The property had recently been transferred into a living trust, of which Helen Mae Washington was the sole trustee. No sale, transfer, encumbrance, or conveyance of any kind could proceed without the trustee's direct written authorization executed in person before a licensed notary. The contract signed by Ms. Caldwell was therefore void from its inception. The letter further noted that the matter had been referred to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office and to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, and that Peachtree Quick Sale might wish to consult its own counsel before taking any further action in connection with this transaction. Raymond told me later that Peachtree's in-house attorney called Gloria's office within 2 hours of receiving the letter. They withdrew from the transaction the same afternoon. They did not notify Brianna. Not that day, not immediately. They simply went quiet. On Wednesday, January 17th, I went in person to each of my financial institutions, the bank, the investment firm, the retirement account administrator, and submitted written instructions, adding a verbal verification requirement to every account. Any transaction exceeding $500 would require a live telephone confirmation from me directly using a security phrase that only I knew and that was recorded in a sealed note at each institution. No power of attorney of any kind, regardless of how it was documented, would be honored without a court order. I was at the bank for 40 minutes and the investment firm for just over an hour. The account manager at the bank, a young woman named Priscilla, who had handled my accounts for 3 years, processed everything without asking unnecessary questions. As I was leaving, she said quietly, "Mrs. Washington, I don't know exactly what's happening, but I want you to know we'll take care of it." I thanked her. I drove home. On Thursday, January 18th, Gloria filed a formal criminal complaint with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. The complaint named Darnell Robert Washington as the primary suspect in the commission of felony forgery, specifically the forgery of a financial power of attorney instrument and financial fraud, totaling $70,500. It named Brianna Caldwell as a co-conspirator in the attempted fraudulent sale of real property. It named Gerald T. Marsh as the preparer of fraudulent legal instruments, while operating without a valid law license in the state of Georgia. The complaint was accompanied by Raymond's 22-page financial analysis, the original forged power of attorney document, a certified handwriting analysis comparing the forged signature to my signature on file, the bank records showing the flow of funds into Caldwell Property Solutions, LLC, and thence to the Cayman Islands account, the structured cash withdrawal records, and the voided purchase contract for the Decatur property. It was, Gloria told me, one of the most thoroughly documented financial fraud complaints she had ever submitted. On Friday, January 19th, Special Agent Carla Nguyen of the GBI Financial Crimes Unit called Gloria to confirm that a search warrant for Caldwell Property Solutions, LLC, and its associated accounts had been prepared and was awaiting final approval. She estimated execution within 5 to 7 business days. She said it was the cleanest package she'd seen in a long time, Gloria told me. Her words. I wrote that down in the blue notebook. Not from pride, from precision. A clean package meant fewer complications. Fewer complications meant faster resolution. Faster resolution meant that whatever came next for Darnell, for Brianna, for Gerald Marsh would come from the evidence itself, not from delays or procedural gaps that lawyers could exploit. That night I called Tanya and said I needed to see her in person. Not on the phone. In person. She said, "Name the place. I'll be there." On Saturday morning, January 20th, I arrived at a small coffee shop on Glenwood Avenue in East Atlanta, 15 minutes before we had agreed to meet. I chose a corner table in the back, away from the door and the windows, and ordered a plain coffee and waited. I had been deciding for 3 weeks exactly how to tell Tanya the truth. Not whether to tell her that had never been in question, but how. What order? What words? I had a daughter who was a history teacher trained to receive information systematically, to ask precise questions, to sit with complicated facts, without needing to immediately resolve them into something simpler. I was going to tell her everything. I owed her everything. I saw her come through the door before she saw me. She was wearing her gray coat, the one with the big buttons, and she had her school bag over one shoulder out of habit, even on a Saturday. She scanned the room and found me, and something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the resolution of attention that had been sitting in her features for weeks. She came to the table. She sat down. She ordered a coffee and looked at me directly across the small table and said, "Okay, Mom, tell me." And I did. I told her everything from the beginning. I told her about Dorothy Hines and the man at the door, about Raymond's call on January 5th, about the forged signature, the $47,000, the $23,500, the Cayman Islands account, and the Delaware LLC registered in Brianna's name. I told her about Gerald Marsh and the suspended law license. I told her about the Decatur property and the January 31st closing deadline that was no longer going to happen. I told her about Gloria's office and the new will and the living trust and the GBI. I told her about Pastor Brooks and what Darnell had asked him in October and what that meant about Plan B. I told her about the witness identification and acknowledgement form that she had signed in August. When I reached that part, I watched her face. I had been watching faces for 63 years. I knew what guilt looked like on a face, and what shame looked like, and what shock looked like. What I saw on Tanya's face was all three, but in a very specific sequence. First the recognition, then the realization of what she had done without knowing she was doing it, then the particular shame that belongs not to wrongdoing, but to having been used. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She looked down at them. Then she looked back up at me. "Mom, I'm so sorry. He said he told me it was just a routine." "I know," I said. I put my hands over hers. "Baby, listen to me. I did not come here so you could apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. You signed a piece of paper that your brother described as something it wasn't. That's not your failure. That's his." Her eyes were bright. She didn't cry, not yet, but she was very close. "I should have read it more carefully," she said. "Yes," I said, "because I will not lie to my children even to comfort them." "You should have. And I think somewhere in you, you already knew that. But knowing you should have read something more carefully is not the same thing as committing a crime. The law understands that distinction, and so do I." She was quiet for a moment. "Is he going to be arrested?" she asked. Her voice was low and very even, the voice of someone holding themselves very still. I took a breath. This was the question I had answered for myself 100 times in 3 weeks, and I still did not have a version of the answer that didn't cost something to say. "That's not my decision," I said. "I gave the truth to the people whose job it is to decide that. Whatever happens next is the consequence of what Darnell chose to do, not of what I did, and not of what you did. We are not responsible for his consequences. He is." She looked at me for a long time. Outside the window, East Atlanta moved past in the ordinary business of a Saturday morning, a man walking a dog, a woman pushing a stroller, a teenager on a bicycle. "What do you need from me?" she said finally. That question, my daughter. 4 words that contained everything I had raised her to be. "I need you to keep being exactly who you are," I said. "That is the only thing I have ever needed from you." She nodded slowly. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand once hard the way she used to when she was small, and we crossed busy streets together. We sat there for another hour. We drank our coffee. We talked about what came next practically calmly, the way two teachers discuss a difficult situation that requires clear thinking. She asked good questions. I answered them honestly. When we left, she hugged me on the sidewalk for a long time, and I held my daughter in the cold January air of East Atlanta and thought whatever this cost, whatever it costs, still at least I have this. At least this part is unbroken. 4 days later, on Wednesday afternoon, January 24th, my doorbell rang at 3:15. I had been reading in the living room a biography of Thurgood Marshall that I had been meaning to finish since November. The doorbell startled me not because I don't receive visitors, but because I had installed a small security camera above the front door the previous month after Dorothy told me about the man who had come to ask questions about my house. I had mentioned this to no one, not even Gloria. I went to the kitchen where my phone was charging and looked at the camera feed. Brianna Caldwell was standing on my front porch. She was wearing a red coat belted at the waist. Her hair was done. She looked as she always looked, as if she had given careful thought to the impression she intended to make. She had come alone. I set my phone on the kitchen counter. I pressed record on the voice memo application, a simple standard feature on any smartphone available to anyone who thinks to use it. Then I put the phone in the front pocket of my cardigan, screen down. I walked to the front door and opened it. "Brianna," I said, "you didn't call ahead." "I know I'm sorry, Helen." She stepped forward slightly, the way people do when they want to be invited in without asking directly. "I was in the neighborhood and I just thought I'd stop in for a few minutes. Is that all right?" I stepped back and let her in. I offered tea. She accepted. We sat at the kitchen table the way we had sat at that table a dozen times before mother and daughter-in-law, apparently, and I poured from the pot and set out the sugar and waited. She talked about nothing for 20 minutes. The weather. A listing she had in Alpharetta that was taking longer to move than she'd expected. A restaurant she and Darnell had tried the previous week. A show she was watching. I listened and responded and gave nothing away. This was not difficult exactly after 4 weeks of Sunday dinners and Tuesday phone calls and Wednesday reading groups. Maintaining a surface had become its own kind of discipline. But it required a particular quality of attention, the kind that is not passive, but is very controlled, and I was grateful for every year of classroom practice that had built it in me. Then she shifted. "Oh, Helen, I meant to ask. Something came up with that Decatur property transaction. The company we were working with said they received some kind of notice from your attorney's office. Something about a title issue." She said it lightly, conversationally, the way you might mention that the dry cleaner had called about a lost ticket. I looked at her. Then I looked past her slightly, the way you do when you're trying to recall something, a gesture I had watched children perform 10,000 times when they were constructing a story on the spot and needed a moment to do it. "Oh, that might be the trust paperwork," I said. "Gloria has been updating some of my estate documents, and she sends me things to sign every few weeks. I sign what she sends me. Half the time I don't even know what it is. You know how I am with paperwork, I just trust her to handle it." I smiled in a way that communicated mild helplessness. A 63-year-old widow who signs things she doesn't understand and trusts her lawyer to sort it out. I watched Brianna process this. "Oh," she said. Her voice was careful. "So you're still working with Gloria Simmons. I thought Darnell mentioned you might be thinking about switching attorneys. Someone closer to home." "Goodness, no," I said. "Gloria's been with me for 11 years. She knows everything. I'd never start over with someone new at this point." Too much to explain. I poured more tea. I offered her one of the shortbread cookies I kept in a tin on the counter. She stayed for another 10 minutes. She talked about a few more neutral topics. Her eyes moved the way they always moved, cataloging, assessing, working. But she found nothing in that kitchen that told her anything other than what I had shown her, a quiet older woman in a cardigan drinking tea, trusting her lawyer and her family, and the ordinary arrangements of her ordinary life. When she left, I stood at the front window and watched her car until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then I took the phone out of my cardigan pocket. I stopped the recording. I listened back to 43 minutes of audio. Her voice, my voice, the clink of teacups, the particular quality of silence that sits between sentences when someone is choosing their words very carefully. Her question about the Decatur property was in there, clear and unambiguous. I called Gloria. She came here, I said. A pause. In person, asking about the Decatur transaction. I have a recording. Gloria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the same quality it had carried throughout, precise, unrattled moving immediately to the next correct step. They know something is wrong. They may not know how much, but they know the transaction is dead, and they're trying to find out why. That means they're going to start covering their tracks. Which means we're running out of time. I'll call Agent Nguyen right now, she said, tonight. I thanked her and put down the phone. I sat at the kitchen table with the recording saved and backed up in 3 places, and I thought about Brianna Caldwell sitting across from me in her red coat with her careful eyes asking her careful questions, believing right up until the moment she walked out my door that she was talking to a woman who didn't know anything. Some people underestimate quietness. They see a woman who doesn't raise her voice and conclude that she has nothing to say. They see patience and call it passivity. They see stillness and read it as an empty room. 35 years in a classroom will teach you that the quietest child in the room is usually the one who is paying the most attention. On Friday, January 26th, 2 days after Brianna's visit and 4 days before Darnell and Brianna's world came apart at its seams, I submitted the complete evidence package to Special Agent Carlin Nguyen. Gloria had assembled it over the previous 3 weeks into a binder that ran to 67 pages. It included Raymond's financial analysis, the forged power of attorney and the handwriting analysis, the bank records and the cash withdrawal documentation, the LLC registration and the offshore account records, the formal complaint from the DA's office, the letters to the financial institutions, the living trust deed now recorded at the Fulton County Courthouse, the new will, the voided Peachtree quick sale contract, and Pastor Elijah Brooks's 2-page handwritten memorandum dated October 16, 2023, describing in precise and measured language the conversation in which my son had sat across from his pastor and laid the groundwork for declaring his mother incompetent. It also included on the last page of the binder a single-page document that Gloria had suggested and that I had agreed to immediately, a formal statement from me, Helen Mae Washington, attesting under penalty of perjury to the accuracy of everything contained in the preceding 66 pages. I signed it on Gloria's conference table with a steady hand. Agent Nguyen received the binder that afternoon by secure courier. She called Gloria 2 hours later. She said, "Tell Mrs. Washington we're ready to move." On Tuesday, January 30th, 2024, I woke at 5:30 as I always do. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window. The sky was still dark, that particular January darkness that holds on longer than you expect. And the garden was invisible beyond the glass. Just my own reflection looking back at me, a 63-year-old woman in a bathrobe holding a mug unremarkable in every visible way. I had known since Friday that today was likely the day. Agent Nguyen had told Gloria, and Gloria had told me with the specificity I had requested, the search warrants would be executed on Tuesday morning early. Darnell and Brianna would be at their home in Alpharetta. Gerald Marsh would be at his house in Marietta. The Caldwell Property Solutions LLC's registered agent address in Delaware would receive a parallel notice. I had had the weekend to prepare myself. I had called Tanya on Saturday evening and told her to expect something on Tuesday and to please not call Darnell when it happened to come to me instead. She had said she understood. Her voice was steady in the way that Tanya's voice becomes steady when she is holding something difficult at arm's length in order to function. I had spent Sunday cooking, not for any particular reason. I simply needed to do something with my hands, and the kitchen has always been the room where I think most clearly, where the rhythm of chopping and stirring and timing gives the mind something to anchor to while it works through everything else. I made a pot of vegetable soup and a pan of cornbread and left them on the stove. Monday I spent quietly. I read. I watered the plants. I sat for a long time in Robert's chair and did not think about anything in particular, or tried not to the way you try not to think about something, and end up thinking about it more precisely than if you had approached it directly. I thought about Darnell at 8 years old, standing at the front of my 3rd grade classroom I had taught there for 3 years before he was born. And when he reached 3rd grade, he was assigned to a different teacher, which was the right call. But I still remembered watching him in the hallway that year. This serious small boy who carried himself with a quiet dignity that looked exactly like his father's. I thought about the afternoon he called me from Georgia Tech when he got his job offer and cried on the phone from gratitude. I thought about the Sunday afternoons when he and Robert sat at this table and talked about engineering and history, and the city, 2 men who understood each other in the easy, uncomplicated way of fathers and sons who have never had cause for anything else. I thought about when that ended. And I thought about the fact that I still did not fully understand why. At 7:43 on Tuesday morning, my phone rang. Gloria. Helen. Her voice was calm the way it was always calm, not because nothing was happening, but because she had decided that calm was the most useful thing she could offer me in this moment. The warrants are being executed right now. Caldwell Property Solutions has been frozen. Gerald Marsh was taken into custody at his home in Marietta at 6 this morning. I set down my coffee mug. And Darnell. GBI is at the Alpharetta house now. I don't have confirmation yet, but Helen, it's done. Everything we built is holding. I thanked her. I put down the phone. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the back garden. In the early light of a January morning, I could just make out the shapes of the azaleas against the fence, bare gray, stripped down to their essential structure. All the work underground. All the waiting. Robert, I thought. I kept my promise. 30 minutes later, Tanya called. Her voice was careful, measured in the way of someone who has decided how they are going to be before they pick up the phone. Mom, there are police cars in front of Darnell's house. I drove past on my way to you. I know, baby, I said. Come on in, I made soup. Tanya arrived at 8:15. She came through the front door and straight to the kitchen and sat down at the table without taking off her coat, and I put a bowl of soup in front of her and sat across from her, and we were quiet together for a few minutes. In the way that only people who have known each other for a very long time can be quiet together without it meaning anything other than that they are present. At 9:22, my phone rang again. The screen said Darnell. I looked at it. Tanya looked at me. Neither of us spoke. I picked up the phone and answered it. Mom. I had heard my son's voice in every register it was capable of producing, the high, bright voice of a small boy, the cracking uncertainty of adolescence, the confidence of a young man who had figured out who he was and was proud of it. I had heard his voice at his father's funeral, rough and compressed with grief. I had heard it over Sunday dinners for 40 years. I had never heard it sound like this. It was very quiet, very controlled in the way of someone who is controlling it because the alternative is something they are not prepared to show. It was the voice of a man who has just watched the structure he built collapse and who is standing in the rubble and who does not yet know what to do with his hands. Mom, he said again. Do you know what's happening? Yes, I said. A pause, long enough that I could hear him breathing. Were you involved in this? I looked out the kitchen window at the garden, at the azaleas, at the fence that Robert had built the summer we moved in post by post one weekend afternoon in July. I protected what's mine, I said. And what was your father's? That's all I did. Another silence. When he spoke again, something had shifted in his voice. The control was still there, but underneath it was something rawer, something that sounded less like the man who had forged my signature on a legal document, and more like the boy I had raised. Brianna is saying you set us up, he said, that you laid a trap. Darnell. I kept my voice even. Not cold, I did not feel cold toward my son even then, even in that moment. I felt something far more complicated than cold, something that had no clean name and that I did not try to name. There was no trap. A trap is something you set for a person who hasn't done anything. What I did was document the truth. The truth is not a trap. Mom, if you would just let me explain. Darnell, my son's name. Just his name. But something in the way I said it, the weight of it, the particular weight of 38 years of loving someone and 38 years of knowing them, stopped him. You know what you did, I said. I know what you did. The people whose job it is to address what you did now know what you did. There is nothing left to explain to me. The line was very quiet. Mom. His voice had changed again. It was smaller now. It reminded me distantly and painfully of the voice of a child who has done something wrong and has not yet decided whether to confess or deny it, that particular suspension between two choices that you can hear in a child's voice before they have learned to fully conceal it. Will you help me? I know I don't. I know I have no right to ask. But you're my mother. I closed my eyes for a moment. I thought about what it would mean to help him. What helping him would require me to do. What it would require me to be. I thought about Robert in the last clear weeks before the illness took his voice from him, telling me to be careful. Not angry, not accusatory, just careful. The warning of a man who loved his son and could see something his son could not yet see in himself. I thought about what a mother's love actually is, what it is at its truest and most demanding, stripped of the comfortable version that asks nothing of either party. And I said what I had known somewhere deep and private that I was going to say. Not because I had rehearsed it, but because it was the most honest thing I had in me, and honesty was the only thing I had ever been able to give my children that was genuinely worth giving. I am your mother, I said. That is exactly why I never taught you that your choices don't have consequences. I failed you somewhere along the way, Darnell, I don't know where. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand it. But I will not protect you from what you chose to do. That is not love. That is a mother's cowardice. And I have never been a coward. The line went silent, then it went dead. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. I sat very still for a moment. Tanya got up from her chair and came around the table and put her arms around me from behind, the way she used to when she was small, and sensed that something in the adult world was heavy in a way she couldn't fully name but wanted to share the weight of. I put my hands over hers. Outside the kitchen window, the January garden was very still. The azaleas stood against the fence in the pale morning light, bare and patient, and exactly where they had always been. 3 days after the arrests, Gloria sent me a copy of the GBI's preliminary findings. I read it at the kitchen table in the evening with my reading glasses on and a cup of tea going cold beside me. The investigation had confirmed what Raymond had suspected from the beginning, that Caldwell Property Solutions, LLC, had been used before. The account structure, the offshore layering the document preparation methodology, none of it was new. It had been practiced and refined. In the 18 months preceding the scheme against me, Darnell and Brianna, working through Gerald Marsh, had approached 4 other women in the greater Atlanta metropolitan area. All 4 were widows over 60. All 4 were identified through Brianna's access to real estate records, which showed property ownership, approximate value, and the absence of a living spouse. Of the 4, 2 had signed the fraudulent documents. Their losses combined totaled $94,000. Both cases were now part of the expanded criminal complaint. One had recognized something wrong and sought legal help before signing. Her attorney had flagged the irregularity to the state bar, which was how Gerald Marsh's name had first appeared in the monitoring system 9 months before he crossed paths with me. And one had refused to sign at all. Her name was Frances Delacroix. She was 68 years old. She lived in Smyrna, Georgia, in a house she had owned for 22 years. She was a retired librarian. Her husband, a high school principal named Walter, had died of a stroke in 2021. In August of 2023, a man presenting himself as a financial planning specialist had approached her at her church. A man who she later told investigators had seemed to know a great deal about her financial situation and her late husband's estate. He had offered to help her update her estate planning documents. He had sent her a package to review. She had looked at it, not recognized the attorney's name on the letterhead, and called her daughter, who had called her own attorney, who had told her to sign nothing and to report the contact. The package sat in a desk drawer. She never signed it. She reported it. And the report, a brief complaint filed with the Georgia Secretary of State's office in September 2023, sat in a database for 4 months, a single anomalous data point, waiting for a pattern to attach itself to. My case became that pattern. When Gloria filed our complaint in January, it triggered the same flag. Agent Nguyen, who had been watching Gerald Marsh's name for months, saw the connection immediately. Frances Delacroix's refusal to sign and her decision to report what had happened was the thread that allowed the GBI to begin pulling. She had never met me. She did not know me. She had simply refused to sign a document that didn't seem right and reported it to the appropriate authority and gone back to her life in Smyrna. And in doing so, she had, without knowing it, protected me. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading that. I opened the blue notebook. I turned to the page where on a January morning 6 weeks earlier, I had written 4 words in red pen and circled them. Who came before me? I looked at that page for a moment. Then I picked up the pen and drew a single line through it. Then I turned to a new page and wrote one name, Frances Delacroix. I underlined it. Then I put the cap back on the pen, closed the notebook, and called Gloria Simmons. I told her I needed to make an amendment to the sealed addendum in my will. She said she would handle it first thing in the morning. 6 months later, in July of 2024, Darnell entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of felony forgery. His sentence was 4 years in a federal correctional facility in South Georgia, with the possibility of early release at 30 months contingent on full repayment of the $70,500 and completion of a financial restitution program. Brianna Caldwell was convicted on 5 counts: conspiracy to commit fraud wire, fraud money laundering, unauthorized real estate representation, and conspiracy to commit forgery. She received a sentence of 6 years. Her assets, including the frozen accounts of Caldwell Property Solutions, LLC, were ordered liquidated to satisfy restitution obligations to all victims. The $70,500 that had been taken from my accounts was recovered in full from those assets by the end of August. Gerald Marsh received a separate sentence for unlicensed practice of law and preparation of fraudulent legal instruments. I will not detail it further. It was sufficient. The 2 women who had lost money to the earlier scheme received partial restitution from Brianna's liquidated assets. It was not everything they had lost. It was not nothing. The Decatur rental property remained in the living trust exactly as I had arranged. The first scholarship from the Greater Salem Baptist Church Education Fund was awarded in September 2024, $5,000 renewable annually to a young woman from a low-income household in southwest Atlanta who was the first person in her family to attend a 4-year university. Her name was Destiny Lawson. She was 18 years old. She was from Macon, Georgia, the same city where I had grown up, the same city where my mother had done hair in our kitchen on Hazel Street and told me that what you build with your own mind and your own hands, nobody can ever take from you. I was there when they gave her the check. I watched her face when she read the amount. I thought about what $5,000 had meant in my own life and what it might mean in hers. Tanya came to Sunday dinner every week. We cooked together, braised chicken cornbread, collard greens. We talked about her students and her reading and whatever was on her mind. Sometimes we talked about Darnell. Mostly we talked about the living things that were present in our lives, not the painful ones that were absent. I went back to teaching. Not in a classroom of my own. I had done that for 35 years, and I had said what I had to say in that particular room. But 3 mornings a week, I volunteered at an elementary school in southwest Atlanta, in a neighborhood where the median household income was less than $30,000 a year, and where 80% of the children qualified for free lunch. I worked with the 3rd graders. Reading groups, mostly. The children who were falling behind, who needed someone to sit with them and make them feel that the words on the page were not an obstacle, but a door. I knew something about that. On a Saturday afternoon in April 2024, I was sitting on the back porch with a book I wasn't reading. The azaleas were in bloom. All of them, the formosa against the back fence, the smaller ones along the side wall, the one Robert had put in near the garden shed that had struggled for years before it finally found its footing. In April, they did what Robert had always said they would do. They came back. Everything that had been underground all winter, all the work that couldn't be seen, came up as bloom extravagant and unhurried as if the cold months had never happened. I sat on the porch and looked at them and thought about the year that had just passed. I thought about Robert. Not with grief, exactly grief, and I had made a kind of peace in the 4 years since he died, the way you make peace with anything you cannot change. I thought about him with gratitude, for the warning he had given me in his last clear weeks, for the 40 years before that, for the fence he had built post by post in the July heat of 1999, and for the azalea he had planted against it, and for what he had said when he put it in the ground. All the work is underground. You just can't see it. I thought about Darnell, not the man who had forged my name on a legal document, or the man who had sat across from our pastor and laid the groundwork for having me declared incompetent. I thought about the 8-year-old boy in the hallway of Cascade Elementary, the young man who had called me crying from Georgia Tech, the son who had come to Sunday dinners and talked to his father about things that mattered. I did not know what had happened to that person or when. I did not know if prison would return him to himself or confirm him in who he had become. I did not know if I would ever sit across from my son again at my own kitchen table. What I knew was this: I had loved him. I still loved him. And love, real love, the demanding kind, the kind that is not comfortable or convenient, sometimes looks like exactly what I had done. It looks like refusing to make someone's consequences disappear. It looks like holding the line, even when the person on the other side of it is someone you would have done anything for in a different version of this story. It is not a painless love, but it is an honest one. I thought about Francis Delacroix in Smyrna, whom I had still never met. A retired librarian who had looked at a package of fraudulent documents and felt something wrong about them, and had called her daughter and had reported it to the appropriate authority, and had gone back to her life without ever knowing that she had begun a chain of events that would eventually lock a door that might otherwise have been left open. She would learn when the time came and the will was read that a woman she had never met had left her $60,000. I did not know how she would receive that information. I hoped she would understand what it meant, not charity, not pity, but recognition. An acknowledgement that her quiet, ordinary act of refusing to sign and picking up the phone had mattered to me specifically in ways I could not have predicted, and she could not have intended. Sometimes the person who protects you is not the person you would have thought to thank. The afternoon light moved across the garden. The azaleas held their color against the cooling air. A cardinal landed in the formosa and sat there for a moment, very red and very still, and then was gone. I picked up my book. I found my place. Tanya was coming for dinner at 6. I had chicken in the refrigerator and cornbread to mix and an hour and a half to sit in a garden that belonged to me in a house that belonged to me on a Saturday afternoon in April that was mine to spend however I chose. Nobody had taken any of it. Not the house, not the garden, not the afternoon, not the life that Robert and I had built together from the beginning, from two people with nothing but determination and a shared understanding that $1 is a decision, and that what you build with your own hands is yours. Not one thing had been taken from me. People sometimes ask me, since the story became known, since people learned what had happened and how it had ended, whether I am angry. I tell them the truth: I was never angry. Not in the way they mean. I was grieving from the moment I understood what my son had done. I was frightened in the early days before the plan was fully formed and the outcome was uncertain. I was tired in the way you are tired when you carry something heavy for a long time and don't let anyone see the weight of it. But angry number anger would have required me to believe that I had not seen it coming, that it had arrived without warning, without pattern, without all the small signs that I had been watching and documenting for months. Anger lives in surprise, and I had not been surprised. I had been sad, which is something different and something harder, and something that no amount of legal resolution entirely fixes. What I was more than anything was determined to protect what Robert and I had built, determined to do it legally completely without stooping to any version of what had been done to me, determined to be the kind of person at the end of all of it that I could recognize in the mirror. I was 63 years old. I had buried a husband and raised 2 children and stood in front of 35 years' worth of third graders and tried every single day to teach them something true and useful about the world. I had learned to read faces before I knew that was what I was doing. I had learned to wait and to watch and to document and to move only when the moment was right. I had not retired from any of that. I had simply found a new classroom. They thought I was vulnerable because I was old and alone and a woman, and because they knew where I lived and roughly what I had. They did not know what I knew. They did not know that the woman sitting at her kitchen table at 6 in the morning reading bank statements with her reading glasses on and writing things down in a small blue notebook was not a woman at the end of something. She was a woman who had been paying attention for 63 years and who had not yet, not by a long measure, finished with what she had to do. They thought that because I was quiet, I was empty. They thought that because I was still, I was finished. They thought that because I was 63 and alone, and a woman who had never raised her voice at them, they thought there was nothing left in me that could stop them. 35 years in a classroom will teach you many things. The most important one is this: the quietest person in the room is usually the one who sees everything.